He had spent years making music in a tiny room no one cared about. Then, overnight, his song went viral, and in just 3 days, Spotify made him a millionaire. Blogs called him a prodigy, strangers called him a legend, and his phone never stopped buzzing. But while the world celebrated, his mother sent a single message that shattered him more than poverty ever had. In one day, she disowned him. The city slept under a blanket of amber streetlights, unaware of the storm about to rise from a cramped bedroom window on the 4th floor of a rundown apartment building. Inside that room, a young man sat hunched over a battered laptop, the glow painting his tired face as the soft hum of an old fan circled the stagnant air. His name was Ethan, and for years he had been a ghost among the living, working shifts at a local diner, scribbling lyrics into notebooks and filling hard drives with beats and confessions no one had ever heard. His mother had always told him that music was a distraction, that dreams were for those who could afford to fail, and failure was a luxury they could not risk. He had obeyed for a long time, or at least pretended to, hiding his songs behind locked folders, recording at night with a blanket over the microphone to keep the neighbors and his mother from knowing the truth of what lived inside his head. The apartment was silent, except for the occasional car passing below and the faint creak of the building settling into the night. Ethan stared at the screen, hesitating over the upload button. He had recorded the track in a single feverish session, his voice breaking and trembling as he poured out years of bottled-up pain and defiance. It was raw, jagged, imperfect, and honest in a way he had never dared to be out loud. It was the story of his life, laced with resentment and longing, confessing the weight of growing up in a home where love was rationed and expectations were walls closing in. He had debated for days whether releasing it would ruin everything, whether the world would laugh or worse, whether his mother would find out and see his words as betrayal. But in that moment, staring at the cursor blinking on the page, the need to be heard won. He clicked upload, and the track began its invisible journey across the digital ether. For a few seconds, he felt nothing. Then a shiver ran down his spine as he realized there was no going back. The song, the truth, his voice, all of it now belonged to the world. He leaned back in his chair, exhausted but buzzing with adrenaline, as if he had just opened a door he had been trapped behind his entire life. Outside, the city carried on indifferent, and somewhere his mother slept peacefully in the next room, unaware that her son had just taken a step that would change both of their lives forever. As the night dragged on, he checked his screen compulsively, refreshing the page to see the first numbers crawl upward. 10 plays, 50, 100. Each tiny spike sent a jolt through his chest. By the time dawn bled into the sky, the numbers had already grown beyond anything he had imagined. Someone had shared the track. Then someone else. Comments began appearing, strangers calling it beautiful, raw, haunting, and real. The words felt like water to a man who had been thirsty for years. He fell asleep at his desk, the sunlight creeping across his face, and when he woke, the world had shifted under his feet. His phone buzzed with notifications he could barely process. Blogs had picked up the track. Playlists had added it. By noon, the song had reached hundreds of thousands of ears, and Ethan felt like he was watching his life dissolve into something unrecognizable. He remembered walking to the kitchen in a daze, the smell of coffee and toast grounding him briefly before he opened his laptop again. The number on the screen was surreal, 1 million streams. In less than a day, the song had caught fire, igniting in the feeds and hearts of people he had never met, people who seemed to understand him more than those closest to him ever had. He sat in the chair, numb and trembling, realizing that something irreversible had happened. Fame, or at least the first hint of it, had arrived not with fanfare, but with quiet certainty, creeping in through the walls of his tiny apartment. And yet beneath the exhilaration ran a slow current of dread, because he knew the song's words had teeth. His mother would hear them. She would know exactly who he was speaking about. She would know the truth he had never dared to say to her face. The clock ticked in the silent kitchen, and Ethan felt both infinite and cornered, as if the world had opened its arms and a chasm at the same time. Hours later, as the first day slipped into evening, the track had already changed his life in ways he could not fully grasp. Emails flooded his inbox with opportunities, contracts, and promises of wealth. Numbers blurred into a surreal haze. 2 million streams, then 3, his bank account blooming with deposits he could hardly comprehend. Yet in the shadows of that sudden victory, a storm was gathering in the small apartment, waiting for the moment when his mother would step into the light of his new world and decide whether to embrace it or burn the bridge behind him forever. Ethan's world transformed almost overnight, though in reality the shift had begun the moment his song left the confines of his small apartment and began echoing through the digital corridors of the world. The next morning felt unreal, like waking inside a dream that refused to dissolve in the daylight. He opened his laptop with trembling hands, expecting perhaps a small spike, a fleeting wave of attention, but what he found was a tidal surge. Millions of streams now pulsed on the screen, the numbers climbing in real time, notifications stacking endlessly like an unstoppable avalanche. His social media, previously a barren landscape of sporadic posts and unacknowledged attempts at connection, had exploded into a cacophony of followers, messages, and tags. People he had never met were praising him as a genius, dissecting his lyrics, making videos with his song as the backdrop to their own lives. In a single breath, the anonymous life he had known evaporated, replaced by a roaring wave of attention that left him dizzy and elated. As hours turned into days, the story of his sudden success spread across platforms, blogs, and eventually into mainstream headlines. Journalists and influencers latched onto the narrative of the unknown artist who had poured his heart into a track recorded in a cramped bedroom and conquered the world in a weekend. Spotify playlists boosted the song into the top ranks, algorithms working in his favor, feeding the track to more and more listeners until it became inescapable. The city he had once felt invisible in suddenly seemed to hum with his presence. He would walk down the street and catch snippets of his voice leaking from car windows or corner cafes. Every encounter felt surreal, as if he were drifting outside his body, watching himself inhabit a life he had once only imagined. The sudden flood of wealth was another layer of unreality. Notifications from his streaming revenue appeared as digits he could hardly comprehend, enough to shatter years of scarcity in a single stroke. He went from counting pennies for bus fare to holding a bank account that could alter the trajectory of his entire life. The apartment that had felt like a cell only days ago now seemed like a cocoon he had outgrown, yet he remained there, pacing from room to room, trying to process what had happened. Emails from record labels and managers poured in, each promising to elevate him further, to make him the next great phenomenon. They spoke the language of contracts, branding, and tours, a world that felt as distant as another planet, yet one that now orbited around his name. Despite the euphoria, a subtle unease began to weave through his triumph. He could feel the weight of the song's meaning pressing against the fragile walls of his personal life. Every time he opened a message from a fan praising the honesty of his lyrics, he thought of his mother, imagined her hearing the confessions he had buried in the track. The pain, the anger, the resentment that had been his private truth was now public property, dissected and consumed by strangers. He knew she would recognize herself in the shadows of his words, and the thought filled him with both dread and inevitability. Yet for the moment, the rise continued unchecked. He received invitations to interviews, late-night talk shows, and exclusive industry events, all delivered with a reverence that seemed absurd for someone who had spent most of his life ignored. The world outside his window seemed to respond to his transformation as if the city itself had shifted tone. Nights became a blur of opportunities. people vying for his attention, and endless messages from fans whose lives he had somehow touched. He experienced the intoxicating sensation of being seen, of no longer whispering into the void, but shouting into a space that echoed back with adoration. But within that noise, a small thread of tension coiled tighter each day. He noticed his mother watching him differently, sensing the change even before she understood it. She had always prided herself on pragmatism, on survival, on living within the narrow lanes of certainty. The life he was stepping into belonged to a world she did not trust, a world she had spent his entire life warning him against. As the week unfolded, Ethan oscillated between the high of his meteoric rise and the tremor of unease gnawing at its edges. He was swept up in calls with managers, producers, and collaborators, his voice careful and polite, yet underneath he felt the rush of someone standing at the edge of an open sky, ready to leap. The apartment that had once shielded him from the world now felt transparent, as if the walls could no longer contain the life bursting from within. He lay awake at night, staring at the ceiling, listening to the hum of the city and the muffled footsteps of his mother moving in the dark, knowing that a confrontation was inevitable. The higher he rose, the closer the collision loomed, but for now, the momentum of his success carried him forward, untouchable and unstoppable, the world clinging to every word of the song that had changed everything. Ethan's life reached a fever pitch in the weeks that followed his meteoric rise. Every hour seemed to bring a new surge of attention, a new headline, a new offer that demanded his immediate response. His song had become a phenomenon, not just a viral hit, but a cultural moment. People across the world were sharing their own stories under hashtags with his name. Celebrities were mentioning him in interviews, and reaction videos flooded every platform. His face appeared on playlists alongside artists he had idolized, and the streams climbed into the tens of millions. At first, the sensation of being everywhere at once was electrifying, like standing in the center of a vast, roaring stadium where every voice was cheering for him. He existed in a state of constant motion, swept from one interview to another, barely sleeping, barely eating, sustained only by adrenaline and the intoxicating weight of sudden validation. He traveled for the first time, boarding flights to cities he had never imagined visiting, escorted through airports as cameras flashed and strangers called his name. Hotel rooms blurred together, each one a sterile sanctuary where he stared out at glowing skylines and tried to comprehend that all of this was real. Music executives wined and dined him, praising his talent and promising him a future filled with awards and endless recognition. He performed on small stages first, intimate showcases where industry insiders watched him with a mixture of curiosity and envy. But soon the stages grew larger, and the roar of the crowds became deafening. Each time he stepped into the lights, he felt both invincible and deeply fragile, as if the love of thousands could lift him higher than he had ever dreamed but could vanish at the first wrong note. The money poured in faster than he could process. Payments from streaming platforms arrived in staggering sums, and brand deals followed almost immediately. Companies reached out to feature his song in commercials, movies, and viral campaigns. He bought things he had never dared to desire, each purchase a small rebellion against the years of scarcity that had shaped him. Designer clothes filled his closet, gadgets cluttered his desk, and yet, despite the abundance, his apartment felt strangely emptier. He had considered moving, upgrading to a space that matched his new reality. But he hesitated. That small apartment had been his cocoon, the birthplace of his art, and now it felt like a museum of a life that no longer belonged to him. The city responded to his fame like a living organism. Murals appeared with his likeness, fans gathered outside venues hoping for a glimpse, and strangers approached him with trembling hands to express how his music had changed their lives. Social media had transformed into a relentless mirror reflecting his own image back at him, endlessly dissected, celebrated, and critiqued. Every post he made drew thousands of comments, some worshipful, some cruel, all insistent that he belonged to the public now. The validation was addictive, each like and share a small spark that fueled him. Yet beneath the surface, exhaustion began to creep in. He had dreamed of this life, imagined it in vivid detail, but he had not foreseen the relentless demand of being a symbol rather than a person. At home, the gulf between him and his mother widened. She watched the chaos of his new life with a mixture of fear and disapproval, her silence a constant reminder of the dissonance between them. Ethan could feel her judgment in every glance, in every clipped word, as if she could not recognize the son she had raised in the whirlwind of fame and excess. He tried to share his excitement, to bridge the gap, but each attempt seemed to make the divide grow sharper. She had always believed in hard work, humility, and quiet perseverance, values that clashed violently with the spectacle his life had become. Her disapproval weighed on him in ways he could not admit to anyone else, a shadow that lingered even in the brightest moments of his ascent. As the peak of his fame solidified, Ethan began to sense its fragility. He saw how quickly the world moved on to the next sensation, how fickle the currents of attention could be. He felt the pressure to create something new, something bigger, something that would prove he was not just a fleeting headline. The adoration of millions was thrilling, but it came with an unspoken warning. It was conditional, temporary, and easily replaced. Every time he opened his phone, he saw another artist rising, another viral story capturing the collective imagination, and the fear of becoming irrelevant flickered at the edges of his thoughts. The nights grew longer and lonelier, even in the midst of adoring crowds and flashing lights. He would return from performances to hotel rooms or his apartment and sit in the dark, listening to the hum of the city, feeling the weight of his own isolation. Fame had given him everything he thought he wanted, yet it had also built invisible walls between him and the life he had once known. In the glow of his phone screen, surrounded by endless messages and praise, he felt the first hints of the hollow space that would soon define his existence, the beginning of a slow unraveling beneath the glittering surface of his success. The shift began subtly, almost imperceptibly, as if the brightness of Ethan's world was dimming 1 degree at a time. At first, he thought it was only exhaustion, the natural crash after months of living in a whirlwind of fame and expectation. He told himself he just needed rest, a few quiet nights, and everything would feel luminous again. But the quiet nights came, and instead of peace, he found an unshakable restlessness gnawing at him. The same phone that had once been a source of endless joy and validation now buzzed with a kind of menace. Each notification, another demand, another judgment, another reminder that he was no longer free. The music that had once poured effortlessly from him began to falter, caught in the weight of expectation, and the blank pages of his notebook seemed to mock him. The melodies that came were pale imitations of the fire that had first made the world listen. As the days passed, the walls of his apartment seemed to close in. The space that had been a sanctuary in his early days of creation now felt like a cage, filled with echoes of a life that no longer fit him. The expensive things he had bought brought him no comfort. They were just objects scattered through empty rooms, reminders of moments of impulsive joy that dissolved almost immediately into silence. He wandered from room to room in the late hours of the night, haunted by the knowledge that he had everything he had ever wanted, yet felt a profound absence he could not name. Outside, the city roared with life, but he felt like a ghost drifting through it, invisible and weightless. The world, too, had begun to shift its gaze. New sensations emerged, new viral hits, new faces that captured the collective imagination. The comments that once overflowed with adoration began to thin, and in their place came questions, criticisms, and speculation. Why hadn't he released another song? Was he struggling? Had fame already consumed him? The narrative of his meteoric rise became a cautionary tale in the making, dissected by strangers who spoke with authority about his life as if they had lived it. Every time he scrolled, he felt a cold pulse of panic, a reminder that the love he had relied on was conditional, that he was now performing not just for applause, but for survival. The tension with his mother reached its breaking point. Her disapproval had evolved into open confrontation, her words sharper, her tone colder. She had watched her son transform from a quiet, hard-working young man into someone she barely recognized, consumed by a world she distrusted and despised. When she told him that she could no longer support the life he had chosen, that she would rather step away than watch him spiral, the words hit harder than any online criticism ever could. The silence that followed her departure was total, a vacuum that seemed to swallow the light from his apartment. He sat in the empty kitchen long after she left, staring at the table, feeling as though the floor beneath him had disappeared. That night marked the true beginning of his withdrawal. He stopped answering calls, ignored messages, and let opportunities pass by without response. Invitations to perform, interview requests, collaborations with artists he once admired, all were met with silence. At first, the industry persisted, sensing perhaps that he just needed space, but soon even they began to move on, their attention shifting to the next name on their list. He found himself adrift, unmoored from the rhythm of the life he had built, trapped in a liminal space between the past he could not return to and the future he no longer wanted to chase. The outside world began to notice his absence. Fans speculated in forums, creating elaborate theories about where he had gone and why. Some thought he was working in secret on a masterpiece, while others whispered about burnout, breakdowns, or worse. His social media became a frozen relic of his former life, the last posts a bright, curated snapshot of a happiness that had already begun to rot at the edges. With each passing week, the world felt a little less connected to him, and he felt himself dissolving into anonymity with a mix of relief and despair. Inside the cocoon of his retreat, Ethan confronted the silence he had spent so long avoiding. Days bled into nights in a haze of half-slept hours, muted light, and the low hum of the city beyond his window. He tried to write, to sing, to recapture the spark that had once defined him, but the music that emerged felt hollow, stripped of the raw energy that had propelled him to fame. The act of creation had once been an escape, a joy, a lifeline, but now it felt like a performance for an audience that no longer existed. He questioned everything, his talent, his choices, even the meaning of the success he had achieved. He wondered if he had ever truly wanted any of it, or if he had simply been chasing the validation of a world that could never love him in the way he needed. Months passed this way, a slow and quiet unraveling. The city moved on without him, and the world that had once seemed to revolve around his voice no longer remembered to call his name. He watched the seasons change through his window, the skyline shifting from summer heat to autumn chill to the deep stillness of winter. Each transition a reminder of how time continued, even when he felt frozen. In his isolation, he began to understand the fragile nature of everything he had built, how fame was both a gift and a curse, how love from millions could never replace the one voice of acceptance he had lost. He disappeared not with a grand gesture or a dramatic exit, but like a shadow fading at dusk, leaving behind only questions and the faint memory of a song that had once made the world stop and listen. The first signs of his return were not public, not loud, and not for anyone but himself. Ethan's re-emergence began in the quietest of ways. A single note hummed in the dark of his apartment on a morning when the sun finally reached through the window and touched his face. It had been months since he had let a melody escape his lips, months since he had even trusted his voice enough to try. But that morning, with the city waking around him, he felt something stir inside, fragile but insistent. He followed it. letting the notes stretch, then bend, and before he realized it, he was singing softly to an empty room. There was no camera, no audience, no expectation. It was just him and the sound, and for the first time in what felt like years, it didn't feel like work. It felt like breathing. As the days passed, he began to rebuild the small rituals of music that had once been his foundation. He cleaned his recording space, brushing away layers of dust that had settled over his equipment. He replaced dead strings on his guitar, wiped the fingerprints off his keyboard, and tuned everything as if waking old friends from a long sleep. Slowly, he started writing again, not with the urgency of a man chasing hits, but with the patience of someone rediscovering his own language. The songs that came were raw and unpolished, fragments of feeling rather than polished products, but they carried a truth that he hadn't felt since the earliest days of his journey. He sang about the hollow quiet of fame, the echo of his mother's absence, the weight of being seen by the world but not truly known by anyone. These were not songs for charts or playlists. They were confessions whispered into the dark. It was during one of those quiet recording sessions that he felt the first flicker of something like hope. He played back a rough track, just a simple chord progression under his voice, and for the first time in years, he didn't hate what he heard. The voice was different now, less polished and confident, a little cracked at the edges, but it carried a depth and honesty that had been missing before. He realized that his disappearance had left a mark, a kind of scar on his art, but it was not an ugly one. It was the kind of mark that told a story, one that some people might need to hear. That thought lodged in his chest, warm and persistent, and slowly the idea of sharing his music with the world again stopped feeling like a threat and started feeling like a possibility. His return to the public eye happened almost by accident. He uploaded a short clip late one night, a snippet of a song recorded in the glow of a single lamp. He didn't announce it, didn't promote it, didn't even put his face on camera. He just let the music speak, raw and unadorned. By morning, the video had spread quietly but steadily, passed between fans who had never stopped wondering what happened to him. The comments were a mixture of joy, relief, and disbelief. People called it haunting, beautiful, different. They said it sounded like the voice of someone who had lived through something real. Ethan read every word, heart pounding, feeling a cautious surge of connection he hadn't dared hope for. Encouraged, he released another track, then another, each one a piece of the story he had lived in silence. He didn't chase the old algorithms or try to recapture the frenzy of his first viral moment. Instead, he let the music unfold slowly, a steady stream of quiet returns that built into something undeniable. The industry noticed, but this time he approached it differently. There were no high-pressure deals, no endless promotional circuits. He set boundaries, guarded his time, and refused to let the world pull him into the same storm that had nearly drowned him before. Fame returned, but in a gentler form, one that he could hold without it consuming him entirely. The most profound moment of his return came not from charts or streams, but from a quiet reunion. His mother reached out cautiously after hearing one of his new songs that had found its way into her world despite the distance between them. She said little, but he could hear the softening in her voice, the recognition of the son she had feared she'd lost. Their meeting was not a dramatic reconciliation, but it was real. She listened as he played the songs he had written in the depths of his isolation, and he saw her eyes shimmer with something like pride and sorrow intertwined. In that moment, he understood that his music had always been a bridge, and now it was carrying him home. As his audience grew once more, Ethan felt grounded in a way he never had during his first rise. He performed again, but only when it felt right, in intimate venues where he could see the faces of the people who listened. Each show felt like a conversation, a shared moment of vulnerability between someone who had been broken and those who had waited for him. His new songs were not just entertainment. They were chapters of survival, proof that he had stepped out of the shadows and reclaimed his voice on his own terms. The world might remember him for the meteoric rise that had once made him a millionaire in 3 days, but he would remember himself for the quiet, patient return that gave his music its true soul.